Hello. I wanted to make a short video to introduce you to really interesting video platform which I've been using in my teaching. It's called Gather. The website address is gather.town. You can see it up at the top there in the address bar. And what Gather is it is a video call platform. So you would use this instead of something like Zoom or Teams, not alongside. But rather than just being a straightforward video platform where your face appears in your little box and everybody else's face appears in their little box and there's no particular physical movement or interaction, Gather is laid out like a video game, and every participant has their own little avatar. And in order to speak to people, you move close to them, and when you move close to them, it makes a connection with them and you can see and speak to them. If you move away, you don't make the connection. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and I think that used with an eye to its strengths and weaknesses, it is absolutely brilliant for teaching. Now, I don't use Gather in every single session. I go between Gather and Zoom depending on what it is I want to do. But I have been using it rather a lot, and I want to show you today a few of the ways, basically how it works, and a few of the ways in which I have been using it. So what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at my Gather dashboard, and it's showing me all the various spaces that I have. And you can either use standard spaces that already exist in Gather, or you can create your own. So, for example, here is a Gather space just called Small Room. And this one is pretty basic, and that's annoying that it's given the wrong name. Hang on a minute. Okay, so this little room is pretty basic and simple. It's also in a bit of a mess because I did use it with some students, and it had the settings set so that anybody could edit the space, and as you can see, they have deleted some of the carpets and thrown some pot plants around, so it's not exactly the tidiest place in here, but still you can see how it works. So it's basically just a small room. I can walk anywhere in it. I'm just using my cursor keys. Alternatively, I can double click on an area I want to go to and my character will just find her own way there. There are these little carpets with tables and chairs. These are what are called private spaces, and when you're in a private space, you can hear anybody who's in that space, and anybody in that space can hear you, but nobody outside of the space can hear what you're saying. So this is ideal for group work. You can create private spaces and you can disperse your groups into private spaces, and then you can freely walk from space to space, and you can duck into this space, and hear what people are saying. And this I find to be much better for group work than Zoom breakout rooms. The reason being mainly that when you're in a Zoom breakout room, you cannot move fluidly and smoothly from one breakout room to the next. You have to log out of one breakout room, log into another breakout room. It takes quite a lot of time. And once people are in breakout rooms, you can't see them, you can't really speak to them. It's not very natural. Whereas with Gather, you can just move very quickly and fluidly between the breakout rooms. The other thing you can do, which you cannot do in Zoom, is you can speak to everybody in the room, regardless if they're in a private space or not. And the way that you do that is by spotlighting. So spotlighting is done either by artificially spotlighting yourself or another participant, and so you click. I've got here on the left hand side is a participant list, same as Zoom has. There's only me in the room at the moment, and I can click on my name and I can click spotlight, and you'll see my name on my my video box here is now turned orange. That means everybody in the room can now hear me when I speak, no matter where they are. And that allows me to broadcast a message across all the teams. So supposing all the teams are working away in a group activity, and I realise that I have forgotten to tell them something, I can spotlight myself and just broadcast across all the rooms. And rather than just sending out a text-based message, which is all you can do in Zoom when people are in breakout rooms, or manually going from room to room to room to explain something, I can speak to everybody. The other way to spotlight is to use a spotlight space. And if you look behind the podiums here, there's a space which is coloured in orange and has a megaphone on it. That's a spotlighting space. So if I unspotlight myself here, if I step into this space it says down the bottom, you've stepped on a spotlight square, now broadcasting to the whole room. And that means that anybody can do that if they want to. So you can use that for student presentations, for example. The other reason I like this much more for group work than Zoom is if students want to speak to me and ask me about something, they can easily just pop out their private space and walk over and find me, speak to me. There is also a hands up function, the same as it is on Zoom, but it's much easier for them to just walk across as they would in real life. The other thing I find really good is it's very easy to allow people to form their own teams in a very natural, organic way. So in Zoom, the only option I have is to either choose myself who's going in which team, get Zoom to randomly assign people to teams, or to go through some kind of time-consuming process of selecting who's going to go into which team. It tends to go wrong in my experience. Whereas with this, I can literally just say to people, right, I want 4 teams, roughly equal sizes, off you go. And they will just go and move themselves the same way as they would in real life. If 5 of them go into one room and there should only be 4, then one of them will come back out and arrange themselves in another room. It makes it much more natural. So this is really, really good for group work, but that is not the only thing you can do with it. So to show you some of the other things I'm going to do with it, I'm going to come out of this small room and show you some of my other spaces. So I'm going to go click the top left and click go home to go back to your dashboard. Okay, so other spaces that I have are, I have this map. This was one of the first things that I used GatherTown for, and it was for a presentation on how to find online tools. And I, instead of going through a linear PowerPoint-like presentation to show how to do this, I wanted to use a mind map. The difficulty with mind maps is they're very easy to create if you've got a piece of mind mapping software, but they're not very easy to present. They're a bit sprawling, they're a bit big. If you zoom right out of them, you can't see the text. If you zoom right in, you can't see where you are in the map. And so they're a bit difficult to present. But Gather makes them really easy to present. So what I did was I output my mind map for the mind map software as a graphic. And I put it into PowerPoint and I dressed it up a little bit. You'll see I've turned it into a series of little islands with palm trees on them. You don't have to do that. You can literally just use the plain graphic. And I then imported that graphic into Gather as a background file, and that allows you to walk on it. And I didn't actually invite any of the other participants in this seminar into Gather because to transition from Gather to Zoom is a bit clunky. You really want to start your session in one platform and stay in that platform. And they were already in Zoom. So instead what I did was I screen shared and I walked through just as a way of presenting. These days, if I was going to use this type of mind map presentation in a classroom, I would actually invite the students to come into the mind map with me through Gather. And so I'll go into this space. And we'll see where it has spawned. One of the annoying things about Gather is it does not start you at the start. So in order to get yourself back to the starting space, you click Settings, User, General, and you click Respawn. And that takes you back to the starting point. So that's the point where I should start my map, is in the end of the little jetty. And basically what I did was I started on this island here, which is the title island, and I just walked them through the island. So I said, oh, how to find new online tools. Let's see how to find new tools. And then I took them into the area which talked about how to Google things effectively. And then I walked back. I took them into the area for what makes a good tool. And I walked around through all the islands and I talked them through the various aspects of the mind map. And it was a very engaging way of doing a presentation. And I would definitely do this again. So that's one way that you can use Gather in order to create an interesting presentation, is by simply walking through things. And as I say, if I was doing this in a classroom now, I would invite the students in with me so that they can actually explore the map themselves. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, and that's very, very simple to use. There's no Gather has interactive objects. There are no interactive objects in this map at all. It is purely a graphic. It's a JPEG which is brought in, and then you can walk on it. Getting a JPEG to be exactly the right scale for your character so that it's not too big or too small, there's some tricks to that, but if you can get that right, then you get a really good way of doing a presentation, which is really unusual and interesting. So I'll go back home again. So that's one way to do a walkthrough mind map presentation. Another type of presentation is another kind of walkthrough where you create a large graphic with all the various parts of your presentation on it, and you take your group through like a tour guide and talk them through it. So that's what this one is. And again, it's started me in the wrong place, so I just go into User, General, Respawn, and it takes me back to the beginning. So this actually was accessed from another space, and that is something you can do in Gather. You can create multiple spaces, and you can link them together. And what this was an alternative to giving a PowerPoint presentation again. But instead what I did was I took the graphics from the slides and I arranged them in a large graphic file, which becomes a walkthrough tour. And what I was talking about was the need for ships to have extra buoyancy above the waterline in order to protect them from emergencies. So I was talking the students through the fact that the buoyancy comes from the part of the ship that's below the waterline, and so in theory you could do without that part of the ship, but that would be a bit silly, as you can self-evidently see. And you can climb onto this little boat, go up into the arrow, and it takes you to the next part. And then we're talking about the fact that ships, in fact, do have quite a lot of volume above the waterline because they need that extra buoyancy in case of something bad happening. And you can add extra buoyancy. And you can see how this works. And whilst I was walking through this, the students were climbing all over these boats. They were having a look at all the different parts of it. And I believe it makes them engage and take a lot more interest in what you're saying, because they're able to kind of get hands-on with it a bit more. They're able to move around, and in this section they're able to swim, and particularly this next part where we came through onto a profile photograph of an offshore support vessel. They really liked this one. They were climbing all over it while I was talking, and that, I think, really made the subject that I was teaching about come to life. And we've got another boat along here that I'll show you. And all of these, the nitty-gritty of how I actually create these images and make it so that they are walkable. It's surprisingly simple. Maybe I'll make another video about that someday. But it really is just a question of bringing in the JPEG as a background and then defining certain tiles on it as being impassable tiles that you can't walk through. So for example, I can't go up there, obviously, because I can't fly, but that's actually because there's an impassable set of tiles above me. That's how it's done. And then you can create other tiles, like you can create private space tiles, you can create spawning tiles and teleporting tiles, but it is really surprisingly simple to do. So again, we've got a lifeboat here. And then we can go down to these next arrows, and they're just jumping me to different places in the same file. So finally we arrive at this tanker. And this tanker has a number of interactive objects on it that you can look at, which tell you things about the information that we're trying to learn. And that allows, this is a free exploration space, so you can just allow the students to climb all over this, find the various information, read it. You can have objects which take you to external, there's the load line marks of the ship. You can look at close up. You can have various objects which take you to external links, show you videos, show you images, have activities in them. It's very, very powerful. And finally, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to follow this arrow, and this arrow is going to take me to my main space. And I have a main space which I use essentially as my classroom in Gather. And I will use that space for group activities. I'll use it for general lectures, and I'll show you how I do that, although there's a limit to general lecturing in it. I use it to take registers and that kind of thing, and I also use it to set up specific activities. So that space is the paddle steamer, and I'll follow this arrow and we'll get through to it. And you'll find when we get there, it's still set up. Now I'm going to respawn myself again. So settings, user, general, respawn takes me back to the starting point. Okay, and the point where people will come into this space is just kind of around the middle. And this is a paddle steamer. Again, this is quite flashy because I'm into graphics and stuff like that, so I like to make things a bit flashy. This is based on, if you're into boats, this is based on the general arrangement drawing of the Bristol Queen, which is a paddle steamer. But it's relevant to me because I teach Merchant Navy cadets and I teach them about ship design and construction. So it's relevant to me for my basic classroom to be a ship. Obviously, depending on what your subject area is, that may not be relevant to you. But this ship has everything I need to operate as a classroom. So first of all, it's got a large space here, the aft saloon. This is a private space. It being a private space means I can gather my entire class in here, and not only can they hear me, I can hear them. And that actually is important because with Gather's proximity-based conversation engine, if I'm outside of the private space, I can talk to all the students by spotlighting myself. Just a reminder, click my name, click spotlight, everybody can hear me. But if I've got a crowd of students standing round me, I'll only be able to hear the closest ones. Whereas if I go into this private space here, when I'm in this private space, I can hear all of them. It becomes like a main room in Zoom. And you can see it's set up like a little cafe. They've got little seats they can arrange their avatars on if they want to. That kind of thing is just to add to the kind of fun and the sort of natural sense of it. So this is where I would come at the start of a class in here in order to take the register, because I need to be able to hear them saying here, here, here. And so that's how I would do that. It's also where I bring them in if I want to have a class discussion. So if I want to be able to say to them, oh, suggest a few ways that this could be, that kind of thing. Get them to call back. I'll bring them in here so I can hear them all equally. If I want to split them up into groups, I will usually put them in the lifeboat. So the lifeboats, each lifeboat is a private space, and that means that I can tell them to go into the lifeboats in roughly equal numbers, and they'll just do that quite easily, just like they would arrange themselves in groups in real life. So I've got 4 lifeboats. I actually do have additional private spaces as well, and this is still set up for an exhibition that I did with a class recently, so there's a lot of objects lying about. I add and remove objects from this map as I need to. So there's a snug here, there's the forward saloon here. These are private spaces as well. So if I need to split into 6 groups, I can do that, or even 7 if I want to stick somebody in the aft saloon. Or I can pop into the editor and I can add extra private spaces as I want to. Other bits and pieces I've got which are permanently here. This yellow square, that's a spotlight space. So they can stand there and they can talk to everybody if they want to present something. They can also share their screen. There's a screen sharing option down here. Away you go. Now, I'll show you a little bit of this exhibition, but not the whole thing. Basically, the way this exhibition works, this is another alternative to just talking to them with a PowerPoint. Instead, I've taken the slides out and I've put them in as objects, and they can work their way through it, and it's not linear. There are 2 streams to this exhibition. So they get near an object, it says press X to interact. Press X and it brings up this slide in the form of a poster. So they can work their way through and they can choose, go this way, go that way to learn about this part of the subject, this way to learn about that part of the subject. And they can go through, they can look at the various posters, work their way through it just like you would through an exhibition in real life. And this seemed to work reasonably well, they seem to like it. And there are other objects as well, they're not all posters. So for example, this one is a video, which will play actually in Gather. Most videos will. Occasionally you'll come across a YouTube video that's been blocked from embedding, and that means that you'll have to just put in a link, but it still works reasonably well. Over here is a web link, so it opens up a web page which is relevant. They can have a read of that. Here there are loads of videos and things in here of different aspects which are relevant to the subject. In here there are more videos. And so they can work their way through this at their own pace. And then what I did was, once they'd all worked themselves through it at their own pace, I said to them, gather at the foredeck and wait for everybody to be finished. And once everybody was finished, I took them through this arrow into another space. And see, there's a note there. Framing Systems Tour, don't go through here until the lecture's with you. They do follow these kinds of instructions. And so you can actually organise the group to move through the space in the way that you want them to. Obviously, if you've got a more rebellious group, then you can set up your space to suit that and have more limitations on what they can do. This incidentally does have quite a lot of limitations. You cannot climb over the side of the boat, for example. So if I walk into this arrow, it will take me to another space. And this other space is another walkthrough tour. And I really like these walkthrough tours. I think that they make an awful lot of difference to how, as I say, how engaging a presentation is. And this one was very easy to make. I already had these diagrams, so literally all I did was I dropped these diagrams into the same file, made sure they were the right sort of scale, and popped these little ladder graphics on top of them, and that's all I did. So these are, again, these have impassable spaces so that you can only get inside the section of the ship by climbing up the ladder. And then once you're inside it, you can climb up the sides of it, climb up the framing on the sides, or you can climb up the ladder at the back to get up onto the deck. And of course they were all doing this, so while I'm speaking they're all exploring the space and clambering around on it. And I got some really good questions actually while I was talking them through how the structure was arranged. I got some really good questions which indicated that being able to move around inside the diagram was giving them an awful lot more understanding and appreciation of how the thing worked, and provoking questions in their minds. So I think this is potentially a really good way of making an online class an awful lot more engaging than it might otherwise be. And then over here's another arrow, and that takes you back to the paddle steamer. Now, Gather's not perfect. There's a few things I would say about it which are worth keeping in mind if you want to use it. One is, tragically, it does not work well on mobile. So if you've got a class where not everybody has access to a desktop or laptop computer, I wouldn't use Gather, because the ones on mobile are going to have a significantly worse experience. I hope they'll fix that someday. I hope they'll come up with good apps, because there's no particular reason from a screen size point of view that it shouldn't work on mobile. It's just that that you can only access it through a browser just now, and it just is glitchy and it doesn't function well. So make sure before you decide to use Gather that everybody in your class has access to a desktop or laptop computer. And bear in mind that sometimes Gather's very demanding on the computer, because it's moving a lot of characters around. It's deciding at every moment where they are relative to each other, and therefore whether to make a video and audio connection, how strong to make it, so that it fades out as you move away. And that's very demanding. And that means that it can sometimes get slow and glitchy. So it's a shame to ask people to turn their videos off on Gather, because the idea of it is it's meant to be a natural method of interaction. But if people start complaining of glitchiness, don't be afraid to ask them to turn their videos off. That will make a big difference. Other issues with Gather, it is the screen sharing is quite good for individual images or something like that. It doesn't handle PowerPoint well. So if you want to do a lecture with PowerPoint or another type of slide-based presentation, I would come out of Gather and go into Zoom for that. Zoom is just much better at that. And so that's its main limitation. Also, don't overdo it on the interactive objects. This obviously has a lot of interactive objects because that was how I decided to run this particular class. That does mean this map at the moment is a little slower and glitchier than other maps I use, which tend to be very, very light on objects, because the objects are very, very powerful, but if you overuse them, you're going to overload the thing and it's going to start getting slow. So a few other words about words. As I say, I'm not going to get into a full tutorial on how to build up a space like this in Gather. Perhaps I will do that later, but for the moment I just want to show you a few wee tips on how to do it. As I say, my spaces are very flashy looking because that's what I'm into, but you really don't need to do that. If you want to bring a graphic into Gather and make sure that it's the right kind of scale to walk on, the trick is each tile, so when I move one tile, one tile, one tile. Each tile is 32 by 32 pixels. And that, I would say, is roughly a metre in the world of the little character. It's about a metre. So if you want to bring in something realistic, like I brought in this paddle steamer and I scaled it to match the Gather scale, 32 pixels to a metre, and that will give you the right kind of scale. And I actually have a graphic that I use for that, which is pretty eye-twisting, but let me just go home and I'll show you it. and I use this as my guide for scaling things. I see this trial space. It's like a purple and yellow chessboard. And that is the tile scale for Gather. So I have this as a graphic. And that graphic I use, say, to scale other pictures to make sure they fit. And I've got all sorts of ideas for things which can be used for graphics on Gather. If you go onto Unsplash, the photo website, and you Google that up, for my subject area, there are a lot of fantastic aerial photographs of ships which you can use for walkthroughs and things like that. So just have a think about how you might use this. If you don't want to create a graphic background of your own, they have templates that you can just use, and so you can just get started really quickly. Just move the objects around. As I say, don't overdo the objects, though, not too many. But you get the idea from what I've got there on my paddle steamer of what works well for a Gather classroom. You want a big-ish space, but it doesn't need to be gigantic. You want a series of small private spaces which can be used for group work. So 4 or 6 of those, depending how big your class is. And you want one bigger private space that you can use as a gathering, as a classroom for the whole class to come in and so that you can hear them and they can hear you. And if you've got that, then I think you can run really good basic classrooms with group work activities and things like that in it. And you can just adjust your space as you need to by adding and removing interactive objects to suit what you want to do. Okay, I hope that was helpful as a kind of introduction to how to use Gather. If you want to know more about the sort of ins and outs and nuts and bolts of how it actually works and how to use it, there are actually a fair few other videos on YouTube from other people who are using Gather and from Gather themselves about how to use the sort of tools and things. But I just wanted to show a demonstration of how you can use it for teaching. Okay, thank you very much for listening.